Moving into Nebraska Estates was supposed to be the beginning of a peaceful new chapter in my life. After 15 years as a lawyer, specializing in property law and civil rights cases, I was tired of the courtroom battles, the late nights drowning in legal briefs, and the endless fights with corporations trying to bulldoze over people's rights. I wanted quiet. I wanted a normal neighborhood where I could come home, sit on my porch with a cup of coffee, and not have to argue with anyone. I should have known it was too good to be true. The first few days were normal enough. A few neighbors waved as I unloaded my moving boxes. A couple even came by with homemade cookies and welcome notes, a wholesome suburban tradition I had only ever seen in movies. But among the friendly faces was one that didn't quite fit, Sandra Whitmore. She didn't bring cookies or flowers. Instead, she showed up on my doorstep with a clipboard and a sharp, calculating smile. "Welcome to Nebraska Estates," she said, her voice dripping with forced sweetness. "I'm Sandra, the HOA president. Just wanted to personally deliver your membership forms." That's when I first felt it, that subtle undercurrent of control, hidden beneath the polite suburban mask. I glanced at the thick stack of documents she handed me. 47 pages of regulations, bylaws, and a monthly fee that was high enough to make my jaw clench. "I appreciate it," I said, flipping through the pages, "but I won't be joining." Her smile twitched just slightly, the first crack in the mask. "Oh, but everyone joins," she said, the forced warmth still in her tone. "It's just how we keep things running smoothly here." I handed the papers back. "Then I guess I'll be the exception." For the briefest moment, something flickered in her eyes, something cold, calculating, and just like that, the smile vanished. Residents who don't participate often find the HOA less accommodating, a thinly veiled threat. I wasn't new to this game. I had spent years dealing with power-hungry landlords, corrupt property managers, and city officials who abused their authority. This was nothing new, just a suburban version of the same intimidation tactics I had seen 100 times before. "I'll manage," I said simply, closing the door. If only I had realized then just how far Sandra was willing to go. It started small, petty inconveniences. The next morning, I found a violation notice taped to my mailbox. "Mailbox exceeds HOA height restrictions. Must be lowered by 2 inches." The same standard mailbox that was identical to every other one on the street. Then came the trash bin complaints. My cans were placed too close to the curb, despite being in the same spot as my neighbors. A few days later, I got another notice claiming my front lawn wasn't up to community standards, despite the fact that I hadn't even finished unpacking. It was classic HOA harassment, the death by 1,000 paper cuts strategy. Sandra wasn't just trying to find me into submission. She was sending a message, comply or suffer. But I wasn't about to bend. I filed formal appeals against every single notice, cited state laws that limited the HOA's power. Every time they tried to find me, I shot them down with a well-crafted legal response. It was a game of chess, and I was always 2 moves ahead. The problem: Sandra hated losing, and that's when she escalated things to a level I never saw coming. I was asleep when I heard it, the explosion. A deep, sickening whoosh followed by a dull thud. My eyes snapped open, something was wrong. I ran to the window and froze. My car, my brand new sedan, engulfed in flames. Fire twisted up into the night sky, black smoke choking the air. The heat from the blaze was so intense that it warped the metal on my garage door. The driveway beneath the car was charred and cracked. I barely registered the sirens wailing in the distance. All I could focus on was the figure standing across the street, arms crossed, watching it burn. Sandra. I knew that smug look, the same look I had seen in corporate boardrooms when CEOs thought they were untouchable. The same look I had seen from landlords who thought they could ignore tenant protections. It was a look that said, "What are you going to do about it?" And that's when I snapped out of my shock, because she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. She had no idea who she was dealing with. I stood frozen in my driveway, my hands clenched into fists at my sides, the charred remains of my car still smoldering under the streetlights. The acrid scent of burned rubber and melted plastic clung to the air, making it impossible to ignore what had just happened. My car, my perfectly parked, legally owned vehicle, had been torched, and Sandra, the HOA president, had stood there watching. As the fire department packed up their hoses and the last embers of my sedan flickered out, Sandra turned to me, arms crossed over her chest, a smug smirk creeping across her lips. "Next time," she said coolly, "maybe you'll reconsider how things are done in this neighborhood." I met her gaze, my heart hammering against my ribs. This woman thought she had won. She thought this was just another petty intimidation tactic, that I'd be scared into submission like the others. She had no idea who I was. She had no idea what she had just done. I took a deep breath, forcing down the surge of rage threatening to boil over. If there was one thing I'd learned in my career, it was never act out of anger, act out of strategy. Because Sandra hadn't just committed an act of vandalism, she had committed arson. And she had done it to the absolute worst person possible. The moment the fire trucks pulled away, I walked back into my house, locked the door behind me, and got to work. Step 1. Document everything. I pulled up my security camera footage and scrubbed through the timeline. Sure enough, there she was, Sandra herself, in the dead of night, pouring gasoline onto my car. And the icing on the cake, when the fire caught, she didn't run. She stood there, arms folded, watching it burn. I saved every frame. Next, I scrolled back even further in my camera history. I needed a pattern. I had a gut feeling this wasn't the first time she, or her minions, had done something like this. Sure enough, bingo. Multiple nights of strange activity around my property. HOA board members walking past my house at odd hours, lingering near my driveway, taking photos of my mailbox and yard. It was clear, this wasn't a random act of vandalism. This was planned. Step 2, call in backup. I picked up my phone and dialed my friend and former law school classmate, Detective Jake Monroe. "Mark," he answered groggily. "It's what, 2 in the morning? I need a favor," I said, my voice sharp. "And trust me, you're gonna want in on this one." He sighed. "Let me guess, your HOA finally went off the rails." "Oh, they didn't just go off the rails," I said, clicking send on the video files. "They burned my car down." There was silence on the line. Then Jake laughed, a low, disbelieving chuckle. "Oh, they screwed up," he muttered. "They really screwed up." By morning, I was sitting at my desk, poring over legal documents while sipping my coffee, my burned-out car still sitting in my driveway like a war trophy. Jake had already called me back twice. First, to confirm that arson charges were on the table. Second, to tell me just how deep Sandra's corruption ran. "This HOA isn't just a bunch of power-hungry busybodies," he said. "It's a full-on organized crime operation. You're not the first person they've forced out." He listed off 6 other names, homeowners who had been harassed, fined, and ultimately pushed out of the neighborhood for refusing to comply with Sandra's iron-fisted rule. And now, with my case, they've escalated to felony-level crimes, he confirmed. "That means federal involvement, my friend." I leaned back in my chair, tapping my fingers against my desk. Federal involvement. Now we were talking. But I wasn't going to just let the system handle this. No, I was going to take this personally, because Sandra and her cronies had underestimated me. They thought I was just some defiant homeowner. They had no idea they had just picked a fight with a lawyer. By noon, I had already sent official legal notices to both the police department and the county prosecutor's office, with a formal complaint against Sandra Whitmore and the HOA board. I attached all my evidence, every video clip, every photograph, and every suspicious transaction I had uncovered. But before I could take a breath, my doorbell rang. I checked my camera feed, standing on my porch, Sandra, and she wasn't alone. Behind her stood 2 of her cronies, Jim Baker, the HOA treasurer, and Helen Porter, the board secretary. They were all dressed perfectly, their expressions rehearsed and composed. I opened the door slowly, keeping my face unreadable. "Mark," Sandra said smoothly, flashing a saccharine smile. "We just wanted to check in on you after last night's unfortunate accident." I stared at her. "Accident," I repeated. "You mean the arson?" Her smile didn't falter. "You know how it is. These things happen." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, sure. Cars just randomly catch fire when HOA presidents pour gasoline on them. Happens all the time." Jim and Helen shifted uncomfortably behind her, clearly realizing I wasn't buying into their charade. Sandra's smile tightened. "Listen, Mark," she said, her voice low. "There's no need to make this messy. We're prepared to offer a settlement, cover the damages, get you a brand new car. All we ask is that you drop the complaint." I chuckled. "Let me get this straight," I said, crossing my arms. "You think you can bribe me into silence? After you committed a felony, after I've got you on camera," her lips pressed into a thin line, I took a step forward, my voice lowering to a dangerous level. "I hope you hired a good lawyer, Sandra, because you're gonna need one." Her eyes flashed. "Careful, Mark," she whispered. "You don't want to make an enemy out of me." I let out a sharp laugh. "Sandra, you already made an enemy out of me, and now I'm going to bury you." Her face twisted for a split second, pure hatred flashing across her features. But then she smoothed it over and turned on her heel. "This isn't over," she called over her shoulder. She was right. It was just beginning. The next morning, things moved fast. The county district attorney was officially reviewing my case. Jake confirmed federal investigators were involved due to the HOA's financial fraud. And my personal favorite, a full audit of the HOA's finances had been ordered. That was when the real panic set in. I stepped outside just in time to see Jim Baker, the HOA treasurer, frantically shoving files into his car. His hands were shaking, sweat dripping from his forehead. "Morning, Jim," I called out, leaning against my mailbox. He jumped, nearly dropping a stack of folders. "Just taking care of some HOA business," he stammered. "Sure," I said with a smirk. "Tell me, Jim, you know the penalty for tampering with evidence? Because I'm sure the feds would be very interested in those files you're trying to hide." His face went ghost white, and that's when I knew the whole house of cards was about to collapse. Sandra and her corrupt empire were finished, and I was going to make damn sure they went down hard. The moment Jim Baker scurried back into his house, clutching those incriminating financial files like a lifeline, I knew one thing for sure: they were scrambling. I smirked, watching from my driveway as Sandra's tight little empire of fear and intimidation began to crumble beneath her feet. She had burned my car. She had tried to buy my silence. She had threatened me. But she had made one fatal mistake. She had no idea what kind of lawyer she was dealing with. And now, I was about to seal her fate for good. By midday, 3 separate law enforcement agencies were actively investigating my case. The local police department. While some officers were in Sandra's pocket, others weren't exactly thrilled about an HOA committing arson. The district attorney's office, now digging deep into Sandra and her board's financial records. And my personal favorite, the federal agents from the White-Collar Crimes Division, already sniffing around for HOA fraud and racketeering. But before we dive into what happened next, and trust me, it's about to get outrageous, just a quick reminder: if you're hooked on this story and love dramatic showdowns like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more of these wild stories to life, and we truly appreciate it. Back to the chaos. The sheer volume of evidence I had gathered was staggering. Video footage of Sandra torching my car, financial records proving HOA funds were being funneled into private accounts. And that was just the beginning. And now, with Jim Baker practically shaking in his boots, I knew it was only a matter of time before one of them flipped. They always do. And that's when I noticed something interesting. Sandra wasn't parading around the neighborhood like usual. No clipboard in hand, no fake plastered-on smiles, no power walking past my house, smirking like she owned the place. I checked my security cameras. Sure enough, her car hadn't left her driveway since that tense confrontation at my doorstep. She was hiding. She knew she had lost control. But if Sandra thought she could just wait this out, if she thought she could just slink away and avoid the fallout, she was dead wrong, because I wasn't done with her yet. That evening, I sat on my porch, sipping coffee and waiting. I didn't have to wait long. Around 7 p.m., I saw him. Jim Baker. He was speed walking, practically jogging, straight toward my house, looking over his shoulder like a man being hunted. I let him sweat, let him feel the pressure tightening around his neck. Then, just as he reached my driveway, I leaned back and called out, "Something on your mind, Jim?" He stopped, chest heaving, sweat dripping down his forehead. Then he blurted it out, "I'll talk. I'll tell you everything." Bingo. I gestured toward the empty seat across from me. "Then sit," I said smoothly, "and start from the beginning." Jim collapsed into the chair, rubbing his hands together like a man who had finally accepted his fate. "It was Sandra," he confessed. "She planned everything. The harassment, the threats, the arson. She runs the HOA like a damn mob boss. I already knew that. What I needed was proof. And Jim had plenty of it. He spilled everything. The bribes Sandra had handed out to keep certain officials in her pocket. The phony fines the HOA had issued just to squeeze money out of homeowners. The kickback schemes for fake home improvement projects that never actually happened. But the real golden ticket, the slush fund, that's why she's panicking, Jim admitted. Because if the feds dig deep enough, they're going to find out she's been skimming thousands off the top. And there it was, the motive. Sandra wasn't just some control-obsessed tyrant. She was running a criminal operation. And now I had the proof to destroy her. The next morning I woke up to something odd. A letter taped to my door. I tore it off, unfolding the crisp paper. Notice of community action. As I read the first few lines, my blood boiled. Sandra, the audacity of this woman, had called an emergency HOA meeting to discuss the removal of a disruptive homeowner. Me. The meeting was set for that evening in the community clubhouse. I chuckled. Sandra was desperate. She thought she could rally the neighborhood against me. She thought she could turn this into a popularity contest and vote me out. What she didn't know, I had already reported every single one of her crimes. By the time that meeting started, she would be walking straight into her own public execution. By the time I arrived at the clubhouse, the place was packed. Sandra stood at the front, her confidence restored, her fake smile plastered across her face. She actually thought she was winning. "Welcome, everyone," she began sweetly, scanning the crowd. As you all know, our community thrives on order and cooperation. But lately, we've had certain individuals causing unnecessary conflict. Her eyes landed on me. "Which is why we've called this meeting," she continued, "to discuss potential next steps." I let out a low chuckle. "Oh, I completely agree," I said loudly, stepping forward. "This neighborhood absolutely needs to discuss next steps, like what happens when the head of the HOA gets charged with arson and fraud." The room fell silent. Sandra froze. I pulled out my phone and hit play on my speaker. Jim Baker's voice filled the room. Sandra planned everything. The harassment, the threats, the arson. She runs the HOA like a damn mob boss. A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. Sandra's smile disappeared. I turned to her, enjoying the way she was finally losing control. "Oh, and if that's not enough," I added, pulling out printed copies of the financial reports, "maybe you'd like to explain these. You know, the thousands of dollars missing from the HOA's accounts." A few gasps echoed in the room. Sandra looked around frantically, searching for support. But guess what? There was none. Her own board members were visibly sweating. Residents who had once feared her were angry. Even the local news crew, which I had personally tipped off, was recording everything. And then, as if the universe had a sense of humor, the clubhouse doors burst open. 2 federal agents walked in. One of them raised a badge. "Sandra Whitmore, you're under arrest." Sandra let out a strangled noise. And just like that, the queen of the HOA crumbled. The moment those federal agents stepped into the clubhouse, the air shifted. Sandra froze, her smug expression melting into pure panic. The room was silent. Neighbors who had once feared her now watched with wide eyes as the queen of the HOA stood completely exposed. And me, I leaned back, arms crossed, enjoying every second. One of the agents, a tall man in a dark suit, pulled out a warrant. "Sandra Whitmore, you are under arrest for arson, fraud, embezzlement, and multiple counts of harassment." Sandra stumbled backward, shaking her head. Wait," she stammered, her voice rising with desperation. This is a misunderstanding. I didn't," the second agent, a woman with sharp eyes, stepped forward. "We have video evidence," she said flatly, "and financial records tying you directly to multiple crimes." Sandra's face drained of color. She turned to her board members, looking for help. But guess what? They weren't backing her anymore. Jim Baker, the same Jim who had confessed everything to me, was already moving toward the agents, and then he did something no one expected. "I'll cooperate," he blurted out. I was pressured into it. "I have more evidence. Just please don't arrest me." Sandra spun toward him, her face contorted in rage. "You traitor," she shrieked. "You were just as involved as I was." Jim flinched, but the agent simply nodded. "We'll discuss your cooperation," she said. "For now, we're taking Sandra into custody." That's when Sandra made her final mistake. She lunged toward me. "This is your fault," she screamed. "You ruined everything." But before she could get close, one of the agents grabbed her and shoved her against the wall. Click. Handcuffs locked into place. The queen of the HOA had finally fallen. As the agents led Sandra toward the door, she thrashed and shouted. "You think this is over?" she screeched. "You think you can get rid of me that easily?" She looked at the neighbors, the very people she had terrorized for years. "You need me," she cried. This community will fall apart without me. Silence. Not a single person spoke. Not a single person stood up for her. Instead, Alice Greenberg, the sweet elderly woman she had tried to fine into bankruptcy, stepped forward. "We're better off without you." Sandra's mouth fell open. Then the entire room erupted into cheers. Neighbors clapped, whistled, even laughed. It was over. Sandra Whitmore was gone. But that didn't mean the fight was finished, because now it was time to clean up the mess she left behind. The very next morning, the HOA board called an emergency meeting. Without Sandra, they were crumbling. The remaining board members, all of whom had played a role in harassing homeowners, issuing fake fines and enforcing Sandra's reign of terror, were suddenly terrified, and they should have been, because I had one final move to make. I walked straight into the meeting, my legal documents in hand. "This board is done," I declared, slamming the papers onto the table. The members flinched. Jim Baker, now fully cooperating with the feds, stayed silent, avoiding eye contact. I turned to the others. "You have two choices," I continued, my voice cold. "One, you resign, dissolve the HOA, and repay the residents every penny you stole. Or, I let the silence stretch before delivering the final blow. Two, you stay, and I personally file lawsuits against every single one of you." The room exploded. "This isn't fair," one woman whined. "We were just doing what Sandra told us to do. We didn't know everything she was doing," another man argued. I smirked. "Then I guess you won't mind proving that in court." That shut them up. One by one, the board crumbled. First, the treasurer resigned, then the vice president. Then the remaining members followed suit, and by the end of the meeting, the HOA was officially disbanded. For the first time in years, my neighborhood was finally free. Meanwhile, Sandra wasn't having such a great time. The federal investigation uncovered even more crimes. Not only had she committed arson, harassment, and fraud, but she had been involved in major financial schemes across multiple HOAs. She had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from residents, and now she was paying for it. At trial, she tried to fake innocence. She claimed she was being targeted unfairly. She cried about how much she had done for the neighborhood. But it didn't matter, because the jury took one look at the evidence, the financial records, the security footage, the confessions, and delivered their verdict in under an hour: guilty. On all counts, Sandra was sentenced to 12 years in prison for fraud, arson, and criminal harassment. Her assets were seized, her home was auctioned off, and the best part, she was banned from ever serving on an HOA board again. The same system she used to control people. Now, it was controlling her. With Sandra gone and the HOA dissolved, the neighborhood finally felt like home again. People talked to each other instead of hiding in fear. There were no more ridiculous fines, no more threats, no more intimidation. For the first time in years, we were truly a community, and as I stood in my new driveway, my brand new car parked safely in front of me, I smiled. Because Sandra thought she could control me, she thought she could bully me, she thought she could destroy me. But in the end, all she did was destroy herself. The HOA was gone, Sandra was in prison, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood finally felt free. But there was one final piece of business to take care of, making sure nothing like this ever happened again. Because while Sandra was the ringleader, she wasn't the only problem. The corruption ran deeper than anyone had realized, and now it was time to clean house. With the HOA officially disbanded, we began sifting through the mess Sandra left behind, and what we found was even worse than we imagined. The HOA had embezzled over $500,000 from residents over the years: bogus fines, fake maintenance fees, unnecessary assessments. All of it went straight into Sandra's personal slush fund. But that wasn't the worst part. Sandra wasn't working alone. There were city officials, contractors, even local police officers who had been in on it. They turned a blind eye to Sandra's crimes in exchange for kickbacks, favors, and under-the-table deals. But guess what? We had proof. Because while Sandra had been sloppy, she was also arrogant. She kept records of everything: emails, bank transfers, even recorded conversations. It was all there. And when we turned the evidence over to the feds, the fallout was massive. Several city officials resigned to avoid criminal charges. A few contractors were blacklisted from ever working in government projects again, and 2 corrupt police officers were fired and arrested for obstruction of justice. Sandra thought she was untouchable. She thought she could buy her way out, but in the end, she took down everyone with her. With Sandra rotting in prison, the money she stole was seized by the courts. And you know what happened next? Every single resident got their money back. All those ridiculous fines refunded. All those bogus assessments repaid in full. And to top it off, the HOA's remaining assets, which included Sandra's house, were sold and the proceeds were used to improve the neighborhood. New sidewalks, street repairs, a new community park, the very things the HOA claimed to care about but never actually did. And the best part, no one was forced to pay for it. For the first time, the community was truly working together, without fines, without threats, without corruption, just neighbors helping neighbors. As for Sandra, well, prison wasn't treating her too well, because as it turned out, she wasn't the queen of anything anymore. Without her money, power, and fake authority, she was just another inmate. And from what I heard, she tried to run the prison yard the same way she ran the HOA. It didn't go well. Apparently, the other inmates weren't interested in following her rules. And last I checked, she was spending most of her time alone, completely powerless. Poetic justice, if you ask me. Because Sandra spent years controlling people, years intimidating, bullying, and terrorizing. And now, she was experiencing exactly what she put others through. No control, no power, no respect, just a nobody in an orange jumpsuit. And I couldn't think of a better ending for her. With the HOA gone for good, life in the neighborhood completely changed. For the first time in years, people felt safe. There were no more threats, no more insane fines, no more fear. Instead, there was trust, there was freedom, and there was a real community. We even started having neighborhood events, something that had been impossible under Sandra's rule. Barbecues, block parties, movie nights, all the things an HOA should have encouraged, but never did, and me. Well, I finally got to enjoy the peaceful life I had moved here for. No more battles, no more legal fights, no more HOA nonsense, just a home, a community, and a life I actually wanted. Because Sandra thought she could break me. She thought she could intimidate me. She thought she could control me. But in the end, she destroyed herself. And we rebuilt stronger than ever. The HOA was dead. The neighborhood was free, and justice had been served. Because sometimes the bad guys don't win, and sometimes the right person fights back.